Welcome to the online impact event introducing the work of Tabita Rezaire. My name is Arjon Dunnewind.
And my name is Laurie Cluitmans.
And I'm the director of IMPAKT, Center for Media Culture in Utrecht, the Netherlands. And together with Laurie, I curated an exhibition, or maybe you could even say 2 exhibitions with the work of Tabita Rezaire. Part of it is in the Centraal Museum, and that's where Laurie works.
Yes, so I was involved as the curator of contemporary art at the Centraal Museum. And I'm actually really happy that we get to host this event tonight and welcome you all, because there's this exhibition waiting for you. And we've installed it, and now it's all there on its own. So luckily we get to do this, this first sneak peek of a part of the exhibition, but also a bigger introduction of who Tabita Rezaire is tonight.
Because for the people watching from the Netherlands, as you might know, we're still in a lockdown. For those of you watching us in other countries, most of the cultural venues, or all of the cultural venues in the Netherlands, are still closed due to COVID-19. So we have this beautiful installation installed with a new commissioned work, Orbit Diapason, and nobody has been able to see it yet. We try to solve that. We'll do 2 events. Tonight is the first event. We've built a web project where a lot of the work of Tabita Rezaire can be seen. You can see interviews and other background material. This web project, we'll talk a bit more about it later in the evening, is rezaire.impact.nl. And of course, we all hope soon we'll be allowed to open the exhibitions again and welcome you as visitors in our venues in Utrecht. Actually, the Centraal Museum and IMPAKT are, I would say, some 800 meters away from each other, so it's an easy walk. And in the Centraal Museum, you can see Orbit Diapason. And at IMPAKT Center for Media Culture, we've exhibited 2 older works by Tabita. It's Sorry for Real, and it's Peaceful Warrior. And a relatively new work that also has some similarities with Orbit Diapason. I'm sure we'll talk about that. And that's Mammales Ancestrales. Maybe first a short introduction about the history between IMPAKT and Tabita Rezaire. To start with, unfortunately, this is an evening without Tabita Rezaire herself. She's at the moment in France Guyana, where she's studying agriculture, because she wants to become a farmer. And so she cannot be with us, but we are very happy that we can present so much of her work tonight. But she has been in Utrecht actually for 2 months in 2016, when she did a residency at IMPAKT. And it was, I think, a half year earlier that I met Tabita in Cairo, in Egypt, at the Kairotronica Festival, where I was invited. And she also, and via a mutual friend, we got introduced. And I must say I was very surprised to see her work in the exhibition there. Happily surprised. I didn't expect such a... It was also a quite explicit work, angry maybe even, and it's the work Sorry for Real that is now on display at IMPAKT. So you can see it here. It's also included in the web project, so you can also see it online. And it was part of the exhibition as an installation there. And I immediately got interested in her work. And funny enough, after the festival was over in Cairo, she stayed in Egypt, and I only found out later that she was traveling, amongst others, to the pyramids there. And the traces of that visit and the research that she did there, you can see that in the other installation that we have at IMPAKT, the Peaceful Warrior. And it's this combination of, on the one hand, a very empathetic way of approaching her surrounding and subjects of her art making. At the other hand, a very sometimes angry, but for sure concerned attitude about relations between the southern and the northern hemisphere, Africa and the Western world, you could say, digital technologies and the power imbalances that we have there. These are elements that she's very concerned with, and in many works these concerns show in a very explicit way. In the later works that we also show bits of tonight, you can see a more spiritual approach to the same kind of subjects. Maybe Laurie, there's something more that you would like to say about that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite an interesting thing about Tabita, that she has this very holistic practice. She is an artist, but she is a healer as well. And before, she has actually described herself as an ancient spirit sent to Earth to learn lessons. And I think that is actually a really, really fitting description of her as a person and her practice as well. And I think in a little bit we'll see a first fragment of Obadiah Payson. I will tell you a little bit more about like the background of this film, and afterwards we'll be screening Deep Down Tidal, the full film. And then we're very happy and glad that Akin Hubbard has accepted our invitation and will join us and give a reflection on Deep Down Tidal and Tabita's practice. And before we screen this short clip from Obadiah Payson, I just wanted to let you know as well that if you have any questions, please send them to questions@impact.nl. And if you're watching via the YouTube channel, I think you can immediately post your questions right there, and then we'll get to it in the Q&A after Akin's reflection. So perhaps let's continue with this short fragment of Obadiah Payson. Yes, so this is just a very short fragment from a 40-minute film, actually. And Obadiah Payson is set up as this 2-channel film installation. And the installation part, which we share later with you, of course, in real is set up like a beehive, or as Tabita calls it, a placental dome. And for this film, she departs from the megalithic landscapes of Africa and the star-aligned stone circles. And actually, in the film that is on view at Impact, Mamelle Ancestral, she first looked at these stone circles and in Senegal and in Gambia. And now returns to the megalithic landscape in South Africa. And she's really fascinated by this idea of how, for mankind, people have been looking at the stars, looking at the stars at night to get their bearings, to understand life, to try and find the answers to the universe. And she connects this in her film to extraterrestrial life, aliens, satellites roaming the heavenly bodies. But and I think this is the main point that Tabita makes in this film, is that this is a way of knowledge. This is a form of knowledge that is within African cosmology and ancestral knowledge very important to understand life. And it's a knowledge that has been lost. And I think in this film, Tabita questions, hegemonic thinking, Western knowledge systems, and a form of global capitalism that have dominated our ways of understanding life right now. So Tabita tries to answer these questions from another point of view, and she does so by interviewing different people like spiritual healers, activists for indigenous rights, a beekeeper, astrophysicists, and mystics. And I think in light of different crises that we are faced with today, we are looking for other answers. And in a way, this is a very hopeful film, I think, that Tabita has made, where we can learn and listen. And I think the next fragments give some first answers in how Tabita is doing this in her film. So I think this is a good first introduction, actually, to the different direction that Tabita is looking for answers, and this critiquing the human-centric ways of thinking and being is something that is actually really deeply embedded in her practice. And I think in this film, Orbit Diapason, and in Mammal Ancestral at IMPAKT, it's very essayistic filming, a very thorough research that she's been doing, and like really a lot of different voices who she offers a seat at the table to explain different ways of looking at life and understanding life. And I think it's interesting now to have a look at Deep Down Tidal, because this is a work she made in 2017, an earlier work, which in style is maybe more activist, you could say, I guess. And she here is concerned with electronic colonialism. And I think a lot of the elements that she is addressing in Deep Down Tidal return as well in Obadiah Payson and her later films. So it's really this feeding ground as well for taking it to taking it further. Arjon, do you want to introduce Deep Down Tidal a bit more?
I could say a few more words on it. Maybe also something looking at the Orbit excerpts that we just saw, and also, of course, having seen the installation in the Centraal Museum. I think it's also very interesting how Tabita in her work also always looks for the female perspective, and also shows examples of African mythologies that put the female perspective a lot more central. And that's something else we'll get to talk with Akin later on. I think that's a nice thing to talk about. And what I liked also, the comparison that in Orbit Diapason she makes, looking at science fiction, and also imagining that science fiction often is a way for the Western world to kind of cope with the fear that they have that for them the same thing would happen that happened to the American continent once Columbus arrived. So an alien element that comes on a continent and thereby completely changes it. So in Orbit Diapason, there's many reference to pop culture, African music culture, or modern music culture. So one of the things I definitely like about Tabita's work is the many references and the many worlds that she draws in her work, from meditation, the holistic approaches that you described, ecological concerns, pop culture, and post-digital culture also very much. And that's something that also shows in the visuals that she's using, and that you will see in Deep Down Tidal that we're going to watch in a while. It's a somewhat earlier work. It's not on display in any of the exhibitions, so not at IMPAKT and not at the Centraal Museum. And that's why we thought it would be nice to allow you this way with this broadcast to see it. It is an installation piece, and you'll notice that the screen that we watch is a very rectangular one. And I've seen it installed in Berlin once, and I've seen it in an exhibition in Berlin. And it's very much about electronic colonialism or digital colonialism, looking at how current day digital economies have many parallels to the colonialism from centuries ago. And it's interesting to now ask, so who are now the new colonizers, and who are the new people that are being colonized? Let's have a look at the 70-minute long Deep Down Tidal, and after that we'll be back, and also Akin will join us, and we hope to also see you again, and also welcome your questions again. But please enjoy first Deep Down Tidal. That was Deep Down Tidal by Tabita Rezaire. And now it's time to welcome our guest of tonight, Dr. Edward Akintola Hubbard. Akin, in short, for friends, we'll ask him about his nickname. Lectures at the University of Utrecht, focusing on the relation between art and society. He looks at art, music, film, media, and literature using ethnographic research methods and bringing art practices into dialogue with cultural theory and global studies. He's currently preparing his first book, that is tentatively called Blue Bataku, the making of an Afro-Creole musical vanguard in Cape Verde, based on over 3 years of fieldwork on the Cabo Verde Islands. Please welcome Edward Akintola Hubbard.
Hello. Thank you, Arjon, and thank you, Laurie, for the wonderful introduction and for inviting me to this event. And I think I have just about 15 minutes, I hope, to kind of maybe contextualize some of the themes that you're seeing here in Tabita's work, which I think is very captivating and really very current, I think. And I think, well, I just wanted to say that the first thing that needs to be said is we are living in a kind of post George Floyd, post Breonna Taylor moment, I think, in Black political and artistic thought and practice. So that's where I kind of first of all want to situate Tabita's work. It's that what we're looking at right now in the academy is this, what I might call the new Black radical tradition. This is something quite a lot of cultural critics and art critics and academics are sort of grappling with right now. We're at a time where I think we're all trying to understand what has happened since last year, since what they call the summer of awakening, some people call it. But I guess the global rise of Black Lives Matter and a whole new return to Black radical thinking and Black radical practice. So I think it's really important to sort of situate Tabita's work within this tradition. I think it's very obvious that it's sort of it's a very good exemplar. But maybe I should say a few things about what I'm talking about here when I talk about this new Black radical tradition, because we have had a Black radical tradition, I think, for well over 100 years. You might want to say it started from the very earliest slave rebellions, and it comes up through the work of intellectuals like W.B. Du Bois and Frederick Douglass. It comes into the 20th century. We have thinkers like Marcus Garvey and later on Malcolm X. But there's the new radical tradition, or the radical tradition, I should say, is I would say to sort of use a more contemporary term that also appears in Tabita's work. But it's a new radicalism that is centered around not being apologetic. Let's put it that way. And Arjon introduced Tabita's work with the word angry, and I'd like to sort of hold on to that for a second, because that's definitely one way to sort of one way of looking at what we're seeing here. But I think just to maybe add a few points to that, that what we're experiencing, of course, anytime you mention radicalism, you almost sound like you're talking about some kind of anger, some kind of rage, some kind of politicized rage, and that's still true. But what I would say is what we're seeing that is emerging now in this new radical tradition is a set of concerns that are, well, the same concerns I think Black radicals have always had with freedom, with justice, etc. But I think this new younger generation, I think, of activists and artists and thinkers, is sort of trying to, I would say, it's a slightly different approach in the sense that all forms of radicalism involve a kind of intellectual labor that is very dispiriting. It involves a lot of emotional and other kinds of investment. And I think one of the first things is to, first of all, see what is actually still true of radicalism, and see what might be a kind of new wave or a set of new gestures. Now, one of the things I wanted to first of all point out with relation to Tabita's work, which has already been, you guys have already kind of keyed me in with the issue of women and gender, but that this new radicalism, as we want to call it, is it's largely intersectional. And for those of you who don't fully understand what intersectionality means, it's now a sort of widely used term. But the idea behind intersectionality is that oppression is never just simply unidimensional. Oppression is never targeting one particular vector or one particular kind of victim in society. That oppression is multifaceted. So oppression is never just oppression of women. It's never just oppression of people of color. It's never just oppression of queer people. It's always interconnected. And so I would say the new radical tradition is very much about taking all these different strands of let's say of oppression and tackling them all at once. So you'll see in work like Tabita's work, you will see well, it's a lot of different concerns intertwined. It's not just simply an anger, as Arjon puts it, towards patriarchal society. That's not new. But what we're also seeing is a kind of a breaking up of this notion of patriarchal society. It's an anger at all of the different things that make a society patriarchal, what you might say patriarchal. So first of all, I think there's a tone of cynicism about it. I did say it's unapologetic, but there's also, apart from just mistrust of patriarchy, but there's also a mistrust of colonial domination. Again, not new, but what is new is a kind of mistrust of colonial domination in a different sense, a colonial domination that is intertwined with colonial capitalism. So there's a clear mistrust of capitalism, of the new sort of capitalist domination of the globe. There's also a mistrust of state apparatus. Okay, clearly, and I think you can see this resonating all the way through, everything from even the far right is feeling this mistrust, but the mistrust of the state apparatus is a very much part of this new radicalism. There's a mistrust of new technological regimes, like the internet, and what Tabita refers to as electronic colonialism. I love that term. There is also a mistrust of, well, there's a mistrust also of anthropocentrism. Meaning that a mistrust of the world we've inherited from, I guess, from the industrialized West, but the centering of the human in all of our concerns about oppression and about freedom. That so mixed in with this sort of mistrust of anthropocentrism is this a tone of environmentalist justice always running through this kind of work. What is new, I think, one thing I can say is definitely new about what we're seeing in this sort of new radical practice is much more of a focus on accountability and transformation. Okay, it's no longer radicalism is no longer just about rights and freedoms. It's not just about pointing out who the oppressor is, but it's about calling for accountability. Justice. It's also calling for transformation, radical transformation of society from the ground up, and that includes everything from environmental exploitation to gender injustice, to violence against people of color, etc., all intertwined. But I also say there's what we see in Tabita's work is a kind of activism that insists on practices of reclaiming the body as a site of resistance. Now, this is something that tacks back to the work of feminists like Audre Lorde, very famous Black feminists like her. But what I think is new here is that it's a radicalism that seeks to move away from, let's say, the radicalism of the 60s and the 70s to kind of the martyrdom that characterizes that age of radicalism. The idea that being a radical is expending as much intellectual and physical and spiritual energy on a project that you may never see actually be realized. Whereas I think this new generation of radical thinkers is very much concerned with not just that awful, soul-crushing labor involved in activism and righting wrongs, but it's also an activism that is very concerned with the self. It's an activism that is about living to see another day. As Bob Marley says, he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day. It's the idea that radicalism requires within it a sense of, well, a concern about self-care. That the radical is no longer someone who just runs out in the street and burns things down. The radical is somebody who needs therapy. The radical is somebody who needs community and care and healing and joy. Okay, and all of these things are necessary to sort of counteract what we might call what Tabita calls electronic colonialism, or what might be called techno-modernity. But I think also what I would love to point out in Tabitha's work, that I've seen in the work of quite a few other contemporary Black diaspora artists, I think, working in the contemporary moment, is a focus on what I'm calling neo-primitivism. In the sense that, primitivism itself has always been a current in modern art. A lot of modern art is founded on these ideas that, escape from, colonial or technological domination. Escape from the modern world requires a kind of going back to the past. It's a kind of reclaiming old, forgotten, lost traditions. Reclaiming old customs as a form of not just radical escape from the moment, but as a form of reconstituting the self in this moment. So neo-primitivism, I would say, requires it's characterized by a kind of an interest in, well, based on all of the concerns and oppositions, I guess, to what we call racial modernity. This neo-primitivist impulse, I think, is about locating ancestral traces. Well, it's, I think, founded on a whole-scale rejection of Christianity and of things like even the contemporary self-help industry. But it's a way of looking within the self, looking within memories, looking even within dreams, the landscape of dreams, to find ancestral traces, hidden ancestral traces, lost ancestral knowledge, and even phantasmatic traces. And in the case of phantasmatic traces, it's a set of intellectuals and artists who are really returning to the question, or returning to the notion of the Black imaginary, the power of the power of Black people and the power of Black culture to create and to imagine new worlds, new utopian worlds for themselves, alternatives to Babylon, alternatives to the sort of current global economic and social domination that people of color are facing all over the world. But within this neo-primitivism, obviously, and this is very much linked to how primitivism has always functioned within art, but it's also a reclaiming of the body, the reclaiming of the body as a site of resistance. It's a reclaiming of anthropology and anthropological practice as a mode of science. And we see this in all through Deep Down Tidal, in a sense that, and you guys mentioned it before, that Tabitha's, well, you didn't mention this specifically, but you mentioned the fact that Tabitha incorporates interviewing and multiple voices, which in fact is a practice that is taken and lifted right from anthropology. It's this sort of new artistic ethnography. It's the fact that what anthropology provides us at this moment is what it does is that it challenges these the Western enterprise of science that centers the white male protagonist scientist as a keeper of all truth and as the font of knowledge. And what anthropology provides is a more sort of democratized approach to science, where it's not just one expert doing one thing, but it's ethnography is about listening for voices that never get heard by the mainstream, listening to voices that are speaking factually about how the world works, but who will never be sort of heard by any kind of mainstream technological outlet, or whose voice will not be sort of brought to the world by way of these outlets. So going back to the point here is that Tabitha's work sort of I think embraces all of these, what I'm calling, I'm once again situating her within what we might call the Black radical tradition, but it embraces all of these different strands of this Black radical tradition. And of course, I think what is important to understand, I think a few terms that I want to sort of raise before we go further with this discussion is, well, what she neoliberalism is a term that keeps being batted around in not just this work, but in discussions like this. But neoliberalism, which is a kind of steady encroachment of economic thinking in all forms of human life, that this kind of artwork, this kind of art practice is very much running counter to this, to the notion of neoliberalism. It's an anti-neoliberal impulse that we're seeing here. So, and to sort of recap, I think what we're seeing here is, or what we can understand Tabitha's work as, is, I guess, a response to environmental injustice on the one hand. It's a response to colonialism and colonial domination. It's a response to modern capitalism, what we might call late capitalism. It's a response to these, the new state apparatus, I should say, the state apparatus that we're living in right now, that not just involves the traditional state apparatus, the police, the law, the legal system, but it involves surveillance. It involves everyday surveillance of citizens and of bodies. It involves what we might call constabulary overreach, or some people might say police brutality. But it's a rejection. It's a response and a rejection to these things. But most importantly, it's a response to this sort of new technology-driven world we live in, where oppression itself is now wrapped up in, and I think deep down Tidal, as we get into the discussion of this, what she's saying is that we're living in a whole, the colonial moment isn't over. But the strategies of colonization have certainly sort of transformed before our eyes, and so what we're doing here is that we're sort of living in a world that is governed by these kinds of these various forms of oppression, and what we need to do is to, I would say, not just to resort to the term, and this is another term I think we should bring up before, Afro-pessimism, which has its place in the moment. Afro-pessimism just refers to a kind of rejection of everything. It's a rejection. It's the idea that optimism of any kind is part and parcel of, colonial assimilation. It's in other words, why dream of a utopia when in fact being pessimistic has its own sort of political value? Well, I would not characterize Tabitha's work as Afro-pessimistic at all. While Tabitha doesn't necessarily point us to any kind of clear utopia or utopian promise, I think what she is doing is giving us a set of new radical technologies, whereby we can question everything around us, whereby we can attack successfully the various tentacles of capitalism and capitalist oppression around us, right? It's a set of methodologies that help us to turn within and to look within ourselves as Black people, as all people of color, as all people in general, to use the body as certain, to sort of reject the notion that healing only comes from, the hospital, the sort of medical industrial complex, but that healing can come from communities. It can come from the self. It can come from everything, from masturbation, narcotic indulgence. There are all these forms of using the body as a tool of questioning, as a tool of escape, and as a tool of reclaiming and recuperating. Okay, and I think I hope that sort of gives a general overview of Tabitha's work. I think what we're going to do now is have an open discussion, I think with Arjon and Laurie, about the film itself, Deep Down Tidal. So let me just turn it back over to you guys, open up the floor.
Super. Thanks a lot, Akin, for your very insightful reflections on the work of Tabita. Laurie, maybe you want to open. I can tell that we already get some questions in from the audience. And those of you who want to also get involved in this Q&A, email us at questions@impact.nl or enter your questions on the YouTube chat. But maybe, Laurie, we first go to you to get some response on what Akin said.
Yeah, sure. Though to unpack your reflection needs another 15 minutes. Thank you so much. That was really such an insightful view on deep down Tidal, but also on I think her practice in general, indeed, what she stands for, and the way you analyze this new Black radical tradition within her practice, or like related to her practice. I think that's really that gives so much food for thought. And I hope it sparked multiple questions from our listeners as well. Let me just recap my... Yeah, so what I thought was really fascinating is how you described being the new Black radicalism now as a concern for the self-care as well, because I think this is such a strong part, has become a bigger and bigger part actually in the practice of Tabita. And you described this anthropological approach of hers, these interviews, and I think that's actually also a way of connecting to this ancestral knowledge, but also a way of connecting to a community that lies beyond. Indeed, like that the self-care is a collective endeavor and is not the self as the individual, but the self as part of such a big history. And I think this is something that Deep Down Tidal shows as well, how that history has been eliminated, or how the trauma of that history was not allowed to be and was not allowed to be mourned, as it was brutally eliminated, basically. So this Afro-pessimism that you described strongly resonated with this, but when I think of Tabita's work, indeed, I don't think she is a pessimist. I think, well, I guess when we saw those first images of her just now in French Guiana, I think this almost this intersectional approach that you discussed, it seems like that's all there, and there's such an optimism there. Well, what I wondered is, opposed to this Afro-pessimism, can we place this Afrofuturism? And is this something that you would associate with her work as well?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think Afrofuturism is actually much more widely spoken about today. I think with films like Black Panther and even within contemporary art, there's so much. Charles Landfroot, his work, I'm bad with his last name, but his work, for example, is a fantastic example of this. I wouldn't necessarily locate Afrofuturism as being in opposition to Afro-pessimism. Really, I don't know if I would do that, but I would say maybe Afro-utopianism instead of Afrofuturism, just because. Yes, just because, well, Afrofuturism, of course, you guys talked a little bit about science fiction earlier, but Afrofuturism, I think, is one of the ways I said earlier that, that what's actually being reclaimed as an important radical practice is the imaginary, the imagining the world a different way, let's say. So it's a form of radical imagining, and we've had, I think, in the African diaspora, at least this is also not necessarily new. It's we've had this kind of what I might call phantasmatic. A sort of phantasmatic, finding and reclaiming phantasmatic traces, for example, is something we see even in the history of, let's say, a movement like Rastafari in Jamaica. The Rastafari in Jamaica, this is, I wouldn't even call this the post-colonial moment, but Rastafari is a religion in Jamaica, for those of you who don't know, it sort of emerged in the 1920s, but it emerged in, I would say, it came out of a Black underclass in Jamaica, a Black underclass that was just coming out of slavery and had no idea. Well, I mean, their entire world was sort of collapsed and crushed. And so what the religion of Rastafari was, well, basically, as the story goes, I mean, when pictures of Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, when pictures of his coronation were circulated, by newsfeed, and these black people in Jamaica saw a king, an African king, a black man sitting on a throne with a crown on his head for the very first time, it led to this moment of just, oh my God, we could be actually kings. Think of what that population was experiencing at this time. To actually see somebody who looks like you sitting on a throne surrounded by world leaders was a massive sort of eureka moment. And so going back to this point about phantasmatic traces, it's that what I think Tabitha is gesturing at is that just a whole religion of, let's say, you might want to call it a whole religion like Rastafari that sort of rejects the West and rejects colonial domination. It came from looking at a photo and reimagining the self and reimagining the possibilities for who a black person could be. And so, yes, when people talk about Rastafari, they think about, oh my God, these guys just saw a picture of this black guy in Africa and thought he was God. Well, no, it's not as simple as that. It's that these people were completely dispossessed of any kind of God, any kind of a sense of self. Their whole history and culture were gutted. So the imaginary is an important site for coming up with other ways of being. So that's how I would sort of put it, instead of just flatly calling it futurism, because futurism can be anything.
Yeah.
Let's look at maybe a few of the questions that we get. The first one that I would like to share with you, Akin, is not a question, but more a comment. The Niet Normaal Foundation congratulates you on your talk. Very good talk. This is the complexity we want to hear. And of course, I agree with that. Thanks, Niet Normaal. And there's a question I would like to share with you by Montse Pujol Zola. In Deep Down Tidal, we could read the sentence, but I love the internet. To me, it felt like the artist had mixed feeling about the internet, for not being a neutral technology, but still loving it. Do you think contradictions are a big part of Tabita's work?
Absolutely, and I think contradiction is a big part of, well, not just her work, but it's a part of it's a big part of the world we live in right now. I mean, we're living with, I don't even want to go into it, but there's so much about modern politics that you're just like, oh my God, didn't this guy just say that this was not the case, and now he's saying it is? That we're living in this bizarre world where contradiction is an everyday thing. It's not something that we run from anymore or that we hide. But I think to sort of go back to that to the crux of that question is she does not, yes, she is ambivalent about technology, right? But I think in the work Deep Down Tidal, and interestingly, I just had a conversation with my nephew about this, because he saw, because we were talking about a little bit about this concept of technological colonialism. But we were talking about this whole notion of fiber optic cables, for example, and Tabitha's argument that, well, the seabed is this place where, well, of course, I mean, it's the graveyard of hundreds of thousands of people who enslaved Africans, for example, but it's also the place where fiber optic cables have been laying. And in a sense, it means that the internet, yes, we can say on the one hand, the internet has given us all these wonderful new democratic ways of participating in society and in the world and in public. But on the other hand, the internet is also, well, I mean, I guess I should leave the more obvious things for last, right? But I think that the less obvious aspects of, I think, Tabitha's critique would be that, well, just to give you an example, I mean, for me to send an email, say from Jamaica to Ghana, it has to probably be routed through a server located in the United States. Okay, if I want to send an email similarly from, say, Indonesia to wherever, I don't know, Indonesia to, let's say, Europe, it has to probably be routed through some server in Australia, some developed country, in other words, or China. which is, of course, the new global power. So what she's simply saying is that even, I mean, on the face of it, of course, technology has all these wonderful things that make life easier and bring us all together. But then beneath it, when you think about things, a simple thing like communication flows. Who governs communication flows, for example? Which countries govern communication flows? Or when you think about, maybe the linguistic apartheid that we experience on the internet, the fact that English is, I'm a native English speaker, but I have to admit it. I mean, English is hegemonic, and nobody even questions it. And of course,
maybe Akin, you allow me to throw in another comment, because it maybe attaches to you, and you could just respond to that in the same flow. Masaccio Ranfagni asks, I would like to know, how do you position the digital language, which may be considered as a Western capitalistic language, in relation to the desire of reconstituting a traditional identity? So it's not maybe the spoken language, but it's more the digital language also. Maybe you can throw that in the pot.
Right. Yeah. We could throw that in, but then again, well, you already that commenter already said it, is that digital language is not neutral either, and the education you need to have or to become digitally literate is also not just widely available. It requires a specific connection, some kind of connection to some kind of educational platform that is probably likely not to exist in one's own place and space in the world, especially if you are poor and you live in the global south, for example. Okay. I hope I answered that question fully. I think
another thing that I would like to ask, and it connects a bit to the contradiction element that we started out with, and I would like to also hear your comments, as I assume someone who's very knowledgeable about African culture and mythologies, and it's about this neo-primitivism that you identified in her work, and reclaiming lost traditions and maybe lost mythologies. And I think the mythologies that she's referring to, maybe my comment do not apply to that as much, but a lot of these mythologies are actually quite conservative. I would say dealing with conservative male-female patterns, or enemy, them, us patterns. At least a lot of mythologies, Western mythologies, have that characteristics. How is that in African mythology? And how do you see her maybe also contradiction in drawing a lot from these mythologies, but then pointing out the ones that can connect to her more inclusive way, female inclusive, gender inclusive ways of looking?
Oh, wow, that's a very heavy question, Arjon. I don't know if you can answer all of that today. But I think, well, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that this recourse to lost, forgotten, or even phantasmatic ancestral traces, that those traces in and of themselves aren't necessarily devoid of sexism and racism sexism and classism and whatever it is, all the other isms that we associate with the West. Excellent point. I think, and before I get to Tabitha, I would say that the whole debate around, which is now a very, very old debate, I think this debate was much more alive in the early 90s, but the whole debate around Afrocentrism, which was, for those of you who don't know, Afrocentrism was this sort of intellectual movement to kind of reposition Africa as the center of the world, and to reposition Africa as the birthplace of all civilization, and also, Afrocentrists, firmly believe that, going back to a sort of ethics and politics of everyday life and was the way to go. It was a sort of utopian way for Black populations to sort of move forward and build their lives in the future. But then, of course, there's a whole scale critique of Afrocentrism, because Afrocentrism, as Arjon is pointing out, the presupposition was that there was something called gender equality before colonialism. It presupposes that pre-colonial Africa was this wonderful place of rainbows and animals running around freely, like those sort of Jehovah Witness religious documents you get from when they knock on your door. But that there's a way that I think what Arjon is sort of pointing to is that there's a way that you have to be also very careful. I would say you have to be very, very careful in just in these practices of reclaiming lost histories, golden ages. All of these things require that reclaiming requires a certain self-consciousness about it. It's not something that you can just do. And so I feel that in Tabitha's work. I definitely feel that it's not just what Tabitha is saying is, oh no, let's not just go and just I don't know, just find some African language and learn it and reject English, or let's go and rebuild our society in the ways that we think African society or what makes society into what African society we think looked like before the white man came along. I think she's a lot more. She's approaching this a lot more intelligently than that, I think. And yes, it goes back to her intersectional feminism and all of these things, where it involves reclaiming these lost traces and so on and so forth, but of course critiquing the hell out of them as well.
Yeah, I mean, we will show another work by her in, I think, almost 2 weeks from now as part of the Rainbow's End Festival. And that is about actually homophobia on the African continent. And she is kind of making the point that homophobia was imported with colonialism. So I would, let's put it this way, like to know a lot more about that, because I find it hard to imagine, as you are saying, that before colonialism it was some kind of utopian society where people respected all kind of gender differences. But unfortunately, Tabita is not here to discuss that with us. Another thing, and that's a question from the chat again by Nick Tsuki, and it kind of connects, I think, to what you just said. Nick Tsuki is curious about Rezaire's process and who the people in her videos are. How does she go about researching these complex issues and making these videos? And as much as I know, she really dives into like a certain scene. She spends a lot of time there. Like now in French Guiana, she moved there to know what it is to be more one with nature, to live from nature and to live together with nature. And therefore she wants to study agriculture, what she's doing now. So what I know about her way of working is it's really getting involved with the subject. And maybe, Laurie, you've got something to say also about that.
Yeah, I think it's also a very consistent and slowly expanding and growing practice and research. It's not that it's research for one film and then she sort of wraps it up, makes the film, and that's it. If you look at her older works, you can really see how her interests in Mammal Ancestral or Obadiah Basin really stem from issues that she asks in a film like Deep Down Tidal, that she's already questioning there, why it isn't so important to understand these cultural, political, and environmental forces behind technological developments. And maybe there it's more of a questioning and finding the questions rather than the answers. And slowly through time, she found different voices who she's been following for a while. And actually, I think Obadiah Basin, I understood from Tabita, is really inspired by Redo Mutwa, who is a traditional healer from South Africa that has been quite influential for her in thinking through these subjects and also returning to this ancestral knowledge, but also thinking about alien life, what the consequences are, in thinking that through from another non-Hollywood perspective. So yes, I think it's a growing process with her that slowly leads to an ever-growing community, I would say. Yeah.
There's one thing. Go ahead, Akin.
Sorry, Arjon, I just quickly wanted to address one point you made before you passed over to Laurie about this question of the Tabitha's suggestion that homophobia was imported by the West. Well, I don't know. I would hope that it's not as simple as that. But I just want to say quickly, I've actually, I mean, I wrote an article for the Guardian about this in relation specifically to the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean. And no, I don't think I was making the claim as well that homophobia was necessarily the homophobia. Homophobia was invented by the West and imported to the global South. But I think what the point is that homophobia as we know it, modern homophobia, the modern notion of a homosexual, I mean, I don't want to invoke Michel Foucault here, but also the modern notion of homophobia as we understand it as a form of oppression, as written into the cultural codes of society, as something that is written into law, in a form of well, in the case of, let's say, the Commonwealth, things like the Offences Against the Person Act. Those things did come from England. Those things did come from colonial law. I mean, and it's not to say that no same-sex loving person in pre-colonial Africa was ever disparaged or cast out. I mean, but again, it's not. What the argument is that the whole legal structure of the whole understanding of homosexuality, homophobia, and the entire legal structure around it did not come from Africa, did not come from the global South, but did come by way of legal imposition, colonial legal imposition. But as I said, it's a complex matter. I don't think we can get into that specific issue in this very short discussion.
Let's welcome the viewers at home to see the next Tabita event where that film will be screened and it will be discussed, I'm sure. There's one other thing that I would like to hear your opinion about, which is about this idea of digital colonialism. And I would argue the colonizers are not the same. They are not countries, but companies. And I'm also afraid that the colonized are not the same, because I think I feel as much colonized by these companies as probably anyone in Africa. And I would even argue that the amount of money that these colonizers can get from us is in the Western Europe, for instance, there's a lot more. I mean, the platform capitalism is, I think, a lot more present and a lot more profitable in Europe, for instance, than in Africa. Or maybe I'm wrong. How do you see that? How do you see in this new digital colonialism, are the colonizers the same and are the colonized the same?
Ooh, Arjon, you're on fire today with your questions. I think, I hope I can do this one justice. I feel that what Tabitha is saying, and I totally hear your point, that, well, the colonizer is, you might want to say the colonizer is slightly different. They're now companies. But I would say, I mean, to kind of challenge you a little bit on that. But going back to the question of where are these companies located? Who runs these companies? Who are the faces of these companies? Has that radically changed? I don't know. The second thing is, you're perfectly right in terms of the fact that people in the West feel almost as colonized. Or you feel colonized by the same set of regimes. So we're talking about a different kind of colonialism. But then on the other hand, if you look at just the way technology has spread and how it has sort of cemented itself globally, I don't know. I think we're colonized. We're all colonized, but to varying degrees. I don't know that you're. I just came back from Cabo Verde, from Africa. I live in the Caribbean. I live I spent a lot of my life in the global South, and I think just a simple issue of access to technology is a different question when you're talking to somebody when you're talking to a colonized like you, somebody colonized in the West, as opposed to somebody colonized, another victim of technological of digital colonialism in the rest of the world. And there are many, many examples of this where
my point is exactly that. The more access you have to these technologies, the more you get colonized. Maybe you should be happy having slow internet because they cannot make as much profit from you.
Right, I see. But then the problem with that, of course, is that you get completely left out of the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of opinions, the marketplace of commodities. I mean, well, for you to kind of do that, it requires a really kind of radical escapism. A sense that I can just go on a boat and go to a desert island and just forget the world. I don't know if that's necessarily possible.
That has become an industry in itself. The whole digital detoxing. So in a way, these radical steps, people are taking these radical steps to get away from.
Right. Yes.
I think it's a very nice conversation, but we should also maybe watch time a little bit. Maybe, Laurie, there's some things you would like to share, or we pick another question that we got in.
Yeah, I was just checking the questions, but how to come back after this question on this forms of colonialism. I think the sense of parasitism, which is something that Tabita addresses a lot in Obadiah Basin as well. I think that is so typical of capitalism, of how the system needs something from outside of it to be fed and to be able to continue. And that is always a form of parasitism in exploiting. Though I cannot compare it to the colonialism and the colonized of history, I must say. There's one tiny thing you just mentioned: the linguistic apartheid, Akin, and actually Tabita made it very clear that this solo exhibition of hers is titled Symbiose Immaculée in French and not in English. Even when we tried to translate it, we were allowed to translate it to Dutch, but not to English. So I think she's very aware, indeed, again, of this what you called linguistic apartheid. What should we do? Should we see for more questions? I don't know if there's any other questions coming in.
What's that? Okay, there's something else. We could pick one question and then kind of close the discussion. Let me see which one. Let's take this one. In Deep Down Tidal, we could read the sentence. No, that's the one I already got. In the introduction, you mentioned, and that's Akin addressing you, that Tabita has a healing approach, water healing. Or maybe it was Laurie's introduction. A healing approach, water healing, for example. What's her view? So, Laurie, what's your view on the internet? Can it be healing, or is it just a new way of polluting and colonizing? Or maybe it's Tabita's view, but how you understand it.
Do
you want to repeat it? I was a bit erratic, maybe.
No, I think I got the question. But do you want to answer, Akin, or?
No, go ahead. You can go ahead.
No, because I think I think the contradiction that was mentioned before is something that returns here as well, that it's not necessarily healing or polluting or colonizing. I think it's much more for her to raise awareness as well of the internet as a physical thing as well, as an infrastructure, and that infrastructure can directly be related to power structures that go back centuries. And the transatlantic slave trade is literally reproduced in the routing or routes, as she mentioned it in the film. I don't know, Akin, do you want to? What do you think? If you take Deep Down Tidal in mind?
Yeah, I would say that what I read this as is a kind of it's a kind of politics of inversion. In a sense, you have to think of it in this sense that, and once again, this is something that I think those of us who do read and study political radicalism, we're very familiar with. Is that just like with language, language was imposed upon colonized peoples, but I think one of the great well, one of the great innovations, I think, of post-colonial thinking was the idea that, well, the colonizer language could be inverted. You could take the power, the same language which symbolizes power and symbolizes the law and the name of the father and so on, and you could invert it. You could take that same language and turn it on its head. You could take the old notion of taking the oppressor's tools and turning them against him. And I think the best example that comes to my mind is the game of cricket, and how cricket in the Caribbean became that one of those things. Is that cricket was there's nothing more British than cricket, and in the English-speaking Caribbean, for example, to have the world's number one cricket team for more than half a century was one. I mean, CLR James has written a lot about cricket in the sense that cricket was something that was it has everything bad about it in it. It's a game of the oppressor, and yet what you can do is take that same thing and invert it. You can take that thing and you can turn it on its head, and you could make it something. You could make it work for you differently. I think that's what she's kind of saying about the internet, is that there's so many different possibilities. And which is why I agree with you that her work isn't pessimistic. It's that she's not just saying, oh my God, the internet is a horrible place, just stay away from it. Oh my God. What she's also saying, though, is that the internet is also the same place that is, the same site of electronic colonialism is where her work is located, where her work is all composed of stuff from the internet. So in a sense, she is making this claim that the internet is something that can be retooled, it can be repurposed, it can be inverted for one's own sort of radical purposes.
Super. Thanks a lot, Akin, for
thank you
being with us and responding to the audience questions. It's very nice to have you in the Netherlands again. And
thank you.
Hopefully we'll be able to open the 2 exhibitions in Centraal Museum and in IMPAKT Center for Media Culture soon. And we will be more than happy to see you. And of course, to see all the audience members. There's a few closing words that we would need to do. In the slide, you can see the web project that I mentioned, rezaire.impact.nl. And the one film that we were supposed to show tonight but didn't get to showing, Sorry for Real, you can see it actually there, as well as some other works by Tabita Rezaire. This event that we had tonight, we'll upload it. So for those of you who missed it, you can also look back at this discussion at rezaire.impact.nl. And then I would like to point out this next event that I already referred to on the 29th of April. And we're doing that together with a festival in Utrecht, Rainbow's End, organized by Creative Coding, among others. Tabita Rezaire, Tainted Histories. We'll show more work by Tabita, and there will be more people discussing her work, so we welcome you to join us. And for those of you who are interested in having an after talk to this event, we'll open the digital Zoom bar, and you can go there and chat maybe a bit more. Akin, I also hope that you can join us there, and we'll have a few words more informal with you and with the visitors of tonight's event. Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Akin, and thanks everybody at home watching.